The void between galaxies is a place of haunting silence and inconceivable distance, a gulf so wide that it swallows time, light, and hope. Few ships dared venture into this empty expanse, and those that did often vanished without a trace. To chart a path through it was madness, a death sentence wrapped in the cold indifference of infinite space. And yet, here they were. The Outrider was a scout ship, an arrow-shaped vessel built for speed and endurance, its purpose to map safe routes between the stars. It was manned by 4. Captain Leon Harker, First Officer Dane Marshall, Engineer Wyatt Oakes, and Navigator Ethan Crane, each man well-versed in the dangers of deep space, but unprepared for what lay ahead. They had left the Andromeda Galaxy a week ago, hurtling toward the Milky Way across the empty, desolate stretch of the void. Their mission was simple: identify gravitational anomalies, plot a course, and avoid the unknown. But even in the best circumstances, no one could predict the horrors lurking in the dark. Harker stared at the data streaming across the console. The vastness of the void stretched before him, the ship's sensors picking up nothing but blackness. "Anything on your end?" Harker asked. Crane, hunched over his terminal, shook his head. "Nothing, Captain. Just the usual gravitational drift. And looks like we're heading into another dead zone. Should be smooth sailing for the next few light years." Wyatt scoffed, his gruff voice crackling over the comms. "Smooth sailing? In the void? You're jinxing us, Crane." Harker smirked, but couldn't shake the knot forming in his stomach. Something about the silence out here felt wrong. Not the usual nothingness of space, but a silence that seemed alive, watching, waiting. "Keep your eyes peeled," Harker said. "This place has a way of turning on you." The crew returned to their tasks, the tension thick in the small cockpit. The ship hummed softly, its systems running smoothly, but outside the windows was an abyss that seemed to pull at their sanity, a cold, featureless black that stretched beyond comprehension. Hours passed. The Outrider drifted through the void, its crew settling into an uneasy rhythm. Then, out of nowhere, the ship lurched. Crane jerked forward, his hands flying over the controls. What the hell? The lights flickered, a low hum reverberating through the ship's hull. Harker shot to his feet. "Status report." "Minor power fluctuation," Wyatt grunted, his voice strained, trying to stabilize the core. What the hell caused that? Crane's fingers danced across the navigation console, eyes wide. "Captain, we've got a gravitational anomaly ahead. It wasn't there a minute ago." Harker frowned. "It just appeared?" "Yeah, and it's massive," Crane said, his voice cracking slightly. It's not on any of the charts." The void was supposed to be empty, devoid of anything but drifting particles and the occasional rogue mass. For something that big to be uncharted made no sense. "Can we go around it?" Harker asked. "No," Crane replied, shaking his head. "It's too close. If we try to divert now, we'll get caught in its gravity well." Harker cursed under his breath. "All right, Dane, prepare for full thrust. We'll push through before it gets any stronger." But as soon as Marshall reached for the throttle, the ship shuddered violently. An eerie, almost inaudible sound echoed the Kodica distant whisper, like static, just on the edge of hearing. "What is that?" Marshall asked, his voice tight. The whispering grew louder, creeping into their ears like a forgotten secret. It wasn't in any language they understood, but it was insistent, gnawing at their thoughts. Wyatt grimaced, slamming his hands over his ears. "Shut it off," he yelled. "Shut it off." "I can't," Crane said, panic rising in his voice. "It's not coming from the ship's systems." The whispering intensified, merging with the ship's vibrations. Harker's hands gripped the armrests, knuckles white. "Dane, punch it, now." Marshall yanked the throttle forward. The Outrider screamed as it accelerated, tearing through the blackness. The anomaly loomed ahead, a swirling mass of nothingness, a rift in space that shouldn't exist. And then, as suddenly as it had begun, the whispering stopped. The ship steadied, the strange anomaly disappearing from their sensors as quickly as it had appeared. But the silence that followed was worse. "Is it gone?" Wyatt asked, his voice shaky. Crane checked the readings. "Yeah, but that was no normal anomaly." "Whatever it was, we're past it now," Harker said, trying to steady his own nerves. "Let's keep moving. No more distractions." But even as the words left his mouth, he didn't believe them. The crew returned to their stations, but the atmosphere had changed. The void outside felt closer, its blackness pressing in on them, as if it had taken notice. Hours passed, then days. The Outrider continued its journey, but the crew began to crack under the weight of unseen eyes. The whispering returned intermittently, brief bursts of sound that seemed to crawl into their minds. At first, it was distant, easily dismissed. But soon it became persistent, a low murmur that followed them wherever they went. Wyatt was the first to snap. "Shut it up," he screamed one day, throwing his tools against the wall of the engine room. "Make it stop." Harker found him curled in a corner, hands trembling. The tough engineer who had faced down supernovas and asteroid storms was a broken man. "Wyatt," Harker said softly, kneeling next to him. "We'll get through this." But Wyatt didn't look at him. His eyes were fixed on the bulkhead, staring into the dark spaces between the rivets. "It's watching us. It's always been watching." Harker felt a chill crawl up his spine. "What are you talking about?" Wyatt turned to him, his face pale. "The void. It's alive." Days blurred into one another as the Outrider drifted deeper into the abyss. Sleep became a distant memory. The crew, already on edge, began to see things, shadows moving outside the ship, flickers of light that disappeared when you tried to focus on them. The whispering grew louder, more insistent. Crane was the next to fall. Harker found him standing by the viewport, staring into the blackness, unmoving. The navigator's eyes were wide, his face gaunt, as if he hadn't slept in days. "Crane," Harker called softly. Crane didn't respond. Harker approached slowly, reaching out to tap his shoulder. "Crane." Before he could touch him, Crane turned, his eyes wild. "It's there. It's outside. I saw it." Harker frowned. "Saw what?" Crane pointed at the viewport, his hand trembling. "It's waiting for us. It's been following us since the anomaly. It doesn't want us to leave." Harker stepped closer to the glass but saw nothing. "There's nothing out there, Crane." Crane grabbed his arm, his grip like iron. "No, it's there. Don't you hear it? It's in the whispering. It's calling to us. If we leave the ship, we'll be lost just like the others." Harker pulled away, alarmed by the desperation in Crane's eyes. "Get some rest. You're exhausted." Crane shook his head violently. "There's no rest. There's no escape. It's out there, and it's coming for us." Harker stepped back, unnerved. "Marshall, take Crane to the med bay. I'll handle things from here." Marshall moved to escort Crane, but the navigator resisted, fighting against him. "You don't understand. It's coming for us all. We're dead, Captain. We're already dead." As Marshall dragged Crane away, Harker felt the weight of his words settle over him like a shroud. Could it be true? Was there something out there, lurking in the void? 2 days later, Crane was dead. Marshall found him in his quarters, a pool of blood beneath his body, his wrists slashed open with a piece of broken glass. His final words were scrawled on the wall in his own blood. "It's inside us." Harker stared at the message, his mind reeling. The void had broken them, twisted their thoughts, and now it was claiming them, one by one. Wyatt was next. The engineer vanished during a routine systems check. Harker and Marshall searched the entire ship, but there was no trace of him. It was as if the void had swallowed him whole. Now it was just Harker and Marshall, alone in the cold silence of the ship. The whispering had become constant, a low drone that seemed to seep into their bones. "We need to turn back," Marshall said, his voice shaking. "Whatever this is, it's too much. We're not going to make it." Harker knew he was right, but the ship's systems had locked onto the course. The only way to stop now was to shut everything down manually, a task Wyatt had been handling. "I'll go to the core," Harker said. "You stay here. Keep an eye on the sensors." Marshall nodded, his face pale. As Harker made his way through the ship, the whispering grew louder. The walls seemed to pulse with it, as if the void itself had become part of the Outrider. He reached the engine room and stared at the core's controls, his hand hovering over the shutdown switch. And then he felt it. A presence, cold and ancient, watching him. It wasn't just in his mind, it was here, in the ship, in the very air he breathed. The whispering coalesced into a single, clear voice. "You're ours now." Harker turned, but there was nothing there, just the empty, black void. His hand trembled as he reached for the switch. The moment he touched it, the lights flickered, and a shadow passed across the viewport. Something enormous, something that shouldn't exist in the emptiness between galaxies, drifted by. Harker froze, his breath catching in his throat. It was real. The void was alive, and it had been waiting for them. He slammed the switch down. The ship shuddered, the lights dimming as the core powered down. The whispering stopped, replaced by an eerie, oppressive silence. But it was too late. As Harker turned to leave, he saw a figure, dark and indistinct, standing at the far end of the engine room. Its eyes glowed with a pale, sickly light. "You can't escape," it whispered, the words crawling into his mind. "You're already part of us." Harker backed away, his heart pounding in his chest. He had to get back to the bridge, had to warn Marshall. But the door slammed shut behind him, trapping him in the dark. The last thing he heard before the void consumed him was the sound of Marshall's scream echoing through the ship. And then, silence. Epilogue. The Outrider drifted on, its crew lost to the endless, empty blackness between galaxies. No one would ever find them, and no one would ever know the horrors that had taken them. In the end, they were just another whisper in the void,